Sarah Coleman was 15 years old when her aunt's husband made it clear she was no longer welcome in their household. It was April 1878 in Cottonwood Flats, Kansas Territory, and Sarah had exactly $8 she'd saved from 3 years of field work, plus knowledge about animal body heat that her father had taught her before dying. Her mother had died from childbirth complications when Sarah was 9. Her father, a livestock farmer who understood animal husbandry deeply, had raised Sarah alone until dying from injuries after being kicked by a horse when she was 12. Sarah had lived with her mother's sister Margaret and Margaret's husband Frank Sullivan for 3 years, working their farm to earn her keep. Then Margaret became pregnant in late 1877. Frank made his position clear in March 1878. They needed Sarah's room for the coming baby. She could work through April helping with spring planting. Then she needed to find other arrangements. At 15, she was old enough to manage herself. Sarah had $8 and memories of her father explaining thermal principles. He'd taught her that livestock generates significant body heat. A cow produces approximately 1,000 BTU per hour. A horse produces 1,500 BTU. Put animals in an enclosed barn and that heat accumulates. Barns stayed warmer than houses in winter because of animal heat rising. She approached Henry Whitmore, an elderly widower who owned a large farm on the edge of Cottonwood Flats. Henry was 72, struggling to maintain his property alone. With a substantial barn housing 8 dairy cows and 4 horses, Sarah made him an unusual proposal. "I'll work your farm, morning and evening chores, milking, mucking stalls, feeding everything, in exchange for permission to build a dwelling beneath your barn. I'll excavate under the floor, create a living space, use the animal heat from above as my heating source." Henry looked at the 15-year-old girl with skepticism. "You want to live underground, beneath my barn? That's unusual, probably unsafe. Why would you build under instead of just building a small cabin somewhere on my land?" Animal heat rises. 8 cows and 4 horses generate approximately 12,000 BTU per hour. That heat goes into your barn, then escapes through gaps in the structure. If I build beneath the barn floor, that heat will warm my space before escaping, plus the barn structure provides roof and weather protection. I'd only need to excavate and build walls. It's efficient. People will think you're living in a hole like an animal. It's not proper for a young woman. I'll be warm and sheltered. That's more important than proper. Henry agreed with conditions. Sarah could build beneath the barn's south section, an area approximately 12 by 14 feet. She'd do all excavation herself. She'd maintain the barn floor structure above. She'd handle all farm chores morning and evening. In exchange, she could live there as long as she worked. Sarah had $8. She bought a good shovel for $2, a handsaw for $1.50, nails for $1, and kept $3.50 for emergency supplies. She began excavating in May 1878. The work meant digging beneath an existing structure, which required careful technique. The barn floor was packed earth with support posts every 8 feet. Sarah excavated between the posts, removing earth bucket by bucket while ensuring she didn't undermine the post foundations. She'd dig down 6 feet, creating a room beneath the barn with earth walls on 4 sides and the barn floor as ceiling. The excavation was brutal beyond anything Sarah had experienced in 3 years of farm labor. Working in confined space beneath the barn meant she couldn't stand upright initially, had to crouch or kneel while digging. The first few days were spent creating enough vertical clearance to work without her head touching the barn floorboards above. The technique required precision and caution. The barn was supported by thick wooden posts every 8 feet, driven deep into the ground. Sarah had to excavate around these posts without undermining their foundations. If a post settled even slightly, the entire barn structure above could shift, potentially injuring the animals or collapsing sections of the building. She'd mark out her 12 by 14-foot area carefully, ensuring she stayed centered between support posts, then begin digging downward. The first foot was the hardest. working in a space barely 18 inches high, unable to use full arm strength, scraping earth with short, cramped strokes. Each shovelful had to be placed in a bucket. When the bucket filled, she'd crawl backward dragging it, emerging from beneath the barn, dumping the earth 50 feet away, then crawling back in for more. Progress was agonizingly slow. On a good day, working 8 hours between morning and evening chores, she could excavate 1 cubic yard, maybe 6 buckets of earth. The total excavation required approximately 70 cubic yards. Simple math. 70 days minimum if she maintained that pace without injury, illness, or exhaustion forcing breaks. Her body protested constantly. The cramped position caused back spasms that woke her at night. Her knees were permanently bruised from crawling on hard-packed earth. Her shoulders ached from the repetitive motion of digging in confined space. She lost weight rapidly, despite eating as much as she could afford. Her caloric expenditure exceeded intake every single day. The worst part was the isolation and darkness. Working beneath the barn meant working in dim light, filtering through gaps in the floorboards. By afternoon, when shadows grew long, the space became nearly dark. She'd work by feel, unable to see clearly, just digging and scraping and moving earth in darkness, broken only by occasional beams of dusty light. Animals above her, 8 cows and 4 horses, walked constantly throughout the day. The barn floorboards would creak and flex as a 1,000-pound cow shifted position directly above Sarah's head. Dust and debris would filter down through gaps. She'd hear the animals moving, lowing, stomping. Sometimes a cow would urinate and liquid would drip through the floorboards onto her work area. She'd just keep digging. The community's reaction was immediate mockery. Sarah Coleman was living beneath Henry Whitmore's barn, digging a hole under animals, sleeping in a pit, living like a burrowing creature. It proved she had no sense, no future, no proper understanding of civilized living. Martha Crawford, wife of the grain merchant, led the public criticism. The Coleman girl is excavating beneath a barn, living underground with livestock above her. It's degrading, inappropriate. She should accept domestic service in town rather than this bizarre arrangement. Henry Whitmore should be ashamed for allowing it. By late June, the excavation was complete. 12 feet by 14 feet, 6 feet deep, 168 square feet of space beneath the barn floor. The earth walls were smooth packed clay, stable and moisture-resistant. The ceiling was the barn floorboards with animals walking above. Now Sarah built interior walls, used lumber from dismantled shipping crates Henry gave her, built stud walls inside the excavated space, creating a finished interior room slightly smaller than the excavation, allowing for insulation space between earth and interior walls. She filled that gap with straw, creating insulation that would trap heat. She built a small door at ground level. You'd descend 5 steps to reach her underground room, installed 1 small window at ground level for ventilation and light, built simple furniture from scrap lumber, created a living space that looked strange but was carefully engineered. The thermal design was elegant. Above her, 12 animals generated approximately 12,000 BTU per hour continuously. That heat warmed the barn floor, which was Sarah's ceiling. The heat radiated downward into her underground room. The surrounding earth provided insulation, preventing heat loss through walls. The result was passive heating from animal body heat. She needed no stove. The animal heat above maintained her underground room at 55 degrees in summer. As autumn arrived and outside temperature dropped, the temperature differential increased the heating effect. Her room stayed at 60 degrees with no active heating. The community called it an animal burrow, said Sarah was living beneath livestock like vermin, said she'd freeze when real winter came because heat rises and she was building below the heat source, which showed she didn't understand basic physics. Sarah knew better. Heat does rise through air, but heat also radiates through solid materials. The barn floor was a solid thermal mass heated constantly by animals above. That thermal mass radiated heat in all directions, including downward into her underground room. basic thermodynamics that most people didn't understand. November brought cold weather, temperature dropping to 20 degrees. Sarah's beneath barn room maintained 58 degrees, with no heating source, except animal body heat radiating through the floor above. Her neighbors in conventional cabins were lighting fires, burning wood, struggling to maintain 55 degrees. People noticed she had no chimney, no smoke, drew wrong conclusions. The girl was freezing, was too proud to admit living beneath a barn didn't work, would probably die when real winter arrived. December brought the blizzard that proved everything and saved 15 lives through Sarah's understanding of thermal mass and animal heat that most people dismissed as impossible. The storm arrived December 12th with the sudden violence that characterized Kansas Plains weather when nothing blocked Arctic air flowing south. Morning started deceptively normal, 25 degrees with clear skies and light wind. Sarah completed her morning chores, milking the cows, feeding hay to the horses, checking water troughs. The animals seemed restless, sensing approaching weather in ways humans couldn't detect. By noon, fundamental atmospheric changes were occurring. Temperature had dropped to 0 degrees in just 6 hours, a 25-degree fall that should have sent everyone scrambling for final preparations. The sky turned gray-white, with particular quality that long-time Kansas residents recognized as extremely dangerous. Wind shifted to blow directly from the north, bringing unimpeded Arctic air across 1,000 miles of open prairie. By 2 p.m., the first snow began falling. Not gentle flakes suggesting gradual accumulation, but heavy, dense snow that created whiteout conditions within 20 minutes. Visibility dropped to nothing. You couldn't see your own barn from your house 50 feet away. The world became white chaos, where direction disappeared and disorientation killed people within minutes of leaving shelter. Temperature continued its relentless drop. 0 became -10, -10 became -15, -15 became -25 by evening. Wind built from 20 miles per hour to 40. Then sustained at 60 miles per hour with gusts reaching 80. The combination of -25 degrees and 60 mile per hour wind created effective temperature approaching -65 degrees. Exposed skin froze solid in under 1 minute. Breathing unprotected air caused immediate lung damage from ice crystal formation in airways. Sarah's beneath barn room barely noticed the external temperature change. Above her, 12 animals continued generating 12,000 BTU per hour. The barn structure protected animals from wind, keeping them warm enough to maintain body heat production. That heat radiated through the barn floor into Sarah's underground space. Her room maintained 62 degrees throughout the storm. The animals above provided constant heat. The surrounding earth prevented heat loss. The underground position meant wind couldn't pull heat from her dwelling. She was warm and comfortable in a space heated entirely by livestock body heat. Her neighbors were in crisis. The Patterson cabin couldn't maintain 45 degrees despite burning wood continuously. Wind was pulling heat faster than they could generate it. The Morrison family's children were showing hypothermia signs indoors. The Henderson cabin had a cracked chimney and couldn't heat safely. At midnight, desperate pounding on the door at ground level. Sarah woke from light sleep. She never slept deeply during storms, always maintaining awareness of animal sounds above, indicating their well-being. She climbed the 5 steps and opened the door carefully against wind pressure. Clara Patterson stood there, frost-covered and barely coherent from cold exposure. She'd walked 1/4 mile from her cabin through conditions that should have killed her. Her face was white with frostbite forming. Her voice was hoarse from cold, damaged throat. "Our children," she managed, words slurred from hypothermia affecting speech. "They're hypothermic, inside our cabin. We're burning everything we have. Can't stay warm. James said we should come here. Said you're warm somehow. Please." Sarah looked at her small underground room, 168 square feet. Could she fit more people? The physics said yes. Body heat from additional people would add to the animal heat effect. More bodies meant more warmth in the confined space. Yes, bring your family quickly before you freeze. The Patterson family arrived within 30 minutes, despite the journey taking 4 times longer than normal. James Patterson carrying their youngest daughter, age 3, who was showing dangerous signs of hypothermia, lethargy, skin grey-blue, confused responses. Clara dragging 2 middle children, ages 6 and 8, who were stumbling from cold exhaustion. Their oldest son, aged 10, walking on his own but shivering violently, teeth chattering so hard he'd bitten his tongue and blood stained his mouth. They descended the 5 steps into Sarah's beneath barn room, and the warmth shocked their cold, damaged systems. The children began crying, not from fear, but from the painful return of circulation to frozen extremities. The youngest daughter started screaming as feeling returned to her frost-nipped toes. Clara sat on the floor, holding her, rocking and crying with relief and residual terror at how close they'd come to losing her. "How is this warm?" James asked, once he could speak coherently, looking around the underground space in disbelief and dawning understanding. "You have no stove, no fire, no chimney. We're underground, but it's warmer than our cabin where we've been burning wood continuously for 8 hours. How is this possible?" Sarah pointed upward at the barn floor ceiling. "Listen." They could hear the animals above. The cows shifting position, horses moving in their stalls, the sounds of 12 large animals living normally despite the blizzard raging outside. "They're warm up there," Sarah explained. "The barn protects them from wind. They're generating body heat, about 12,000 BTU per hour combined. That heat warms the barn floor, which is our ceiling. The floor radiates that heat downward into this space. The earth walls insulate us. We're underground, so wind can't pull heat away. The animals above are heating this room. Within 90 minutes, more desperate arrivals. The Morrison family, whose cabin corner joints had separated from wind stress, creating gaps that let in deadly cold. Their 3 children were in early hypothermia stages, despite being indoors wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Then the Henderson family, whose chimney had cracked, filling their cabin with smoke and making heating impossible. Then the young Baker couple, newlyweds in their early 20s, whose small cabin simply couldn't maintain temperature against the wind force. By 3 a.m., 15 people were crowded into Sarah's 168-square-foot beneath barn room. Adults sitting with backs against the interior walls, knees drawn up to save space. Children layered together on Sarah's bed in the corner, youngest in warmest center positions. Everyone pressed together, everyone touching, everyone sharing the limited space, and everyone was warm, genuinely, comfortably warm. The underground room at 64 degrees, the animal heat from above radiating steadily through the thermal mass of the barn floor, the earth walls preventing any heat loss, the underground position making wind irrelevant, 15 people's combined body heat adding another 1,500 BTU per hour to the system. Total heating approaching 14,000 BTU, maintaining approximately 150 cubic feet of actual air volume, more than adequate for comfortable temperature despite -25 degrees and 60-mile-per-hour wind outside. Sarah had no active heat source to manage. The animals above continued their normal body heat production. That heat continued radiating through the thermal mass of the barn floor. The beneath barn room stayed at 64 degrees throughout the night, with 15 people's body heat adding to the animal heat effect. The blizzard lasted 36 hours. Through all of it, 15 people stayed warm in the space everyone had called degrading. The structure, built by a 15-year-old with $8, heated entirely by animal body heat, maintained comfortable temperature while conventional construction failed catastrophically. When the storm ended December 14th, families returned to find their cabins barely above freezing, despite having burned enormous amounts of wood. The Patterson family had consumed a week's worth of fuel in 36 hours and still couldn't maintain safe temperature. Sarah's beneath barn room had used zero fuel and stayed warmer. Frank Sullivan, Sarah's uncle who'd asked her to leave, came to Henry Whitmore's farm on December 15th. Stood looking at the ground-level entrance to the beneath barn room, at the structure he'd called degrading, at the dwelling that had saved 15 lives, including families he'd known for years. "I was wrong," he said to Sarah, "about everything. I thought you were living in degrading conditions. I didn't understand you'd engineered something superior to conventional housing. I'm sorry I asked you to leave. Sorry I didn't help you build this." The community transformed overnight from mockery to fascination, but the change went deeper than simple acknowledgement of Sarah's success. People began questioning fundamental assumptions about heating, about proper construction, about where homes should be built. Frank Sullivan, Sarah's uncle who'd asked her to leave to make room for his coming baby, came to Henry Whitmore's farm on December 15th after the storm cleared. He'd heard from the Patterson family what had happened, walked out to see the beneath barn structure for himself. He stood looking at the ground-level entrance, just a simple door set into the earth beside the barn foundation. Nothing impressive from outside, nothing suggesting the innovation beneath. He descended the 5 steps into Sarah's underground room, felt the warmth with no visible heat source, understood immediately what he'd failed to understand before. "I was wrong," he said, voice heavy with something beyond simple apology. "About everything. I thought you were living in degrading conditions, sleeping beneath animals like you'd given up on civilized living. I didn't understand you'd engineered something superior to every cabin in this valley. I'm sorry I asked you to leave. Sorry I didn't recognize what you were building." Sarah didn't gloat or lecture, simply said, "The physics work whether people understand them or not. Animals generate heat. Thermal mass radiates heat. Underground spaces retain heat. Put them together correctly, and you get passive heating that never fails." The Valley community needed to understand what had actually happened. Martha Crawford, who'd led criticism calling Sarah's dwelling degrading, organized a gathering specifically to hear Sarah explain beneath barn heating principles. The same woman who'd said Sarah should be ashamed now wanted to learn from her. Sarah stood before 40 townspeople in late December and taught thermal physics most of them had never considered. A dairy cow produces approximately 1,000 BTU per hour from body heat. A horse produces 1,500 BTU. That's continuous production. They generate it just by being alive and maintaining body temperature. Put 12 animals in an enclosed barn and you have 12,000 BTU per hour being generated constantly. In a normal barn, that heat warms the structure and then escapes through gaps and roof spaces. It's wasted. But if you build living space beneath the barn floor, that floor becomes a thermal mass, a solid material that absorbs heat and radiates it. The heat radiates in all directions, including downward. You're capturing heat that would otherwise be wasted. She showed diagrams she'd drawn explaining thermal radiation. Heat transfers 3 ways: conduction through direct contact, convection through air movement, and radiation through electromagnetic waves. Most people only think about convection, hot air rising, but radiation works in all directions. The barn floor above me is continuously heated by animals walking on it and air warmed by animals. That floor radiates heat downward through radiation, warming my space beneath. The surrounding earth provides insulation with R value of approximately 20, better than most cabin walls. The underground position means wind can't pull heat away through convection. The result is passive heating requiring zero fuel and zero maintenance. The animals eat hay and produce heat. That heat warms my living space. It costs nothing and never fails as long as animals are alive and eating. James Patterson stood up and addressed the gathering. My family owes our lives to Sarah's understanding of these principles. We were in our cabin burning wood, desperately for 8 hours. Our children were hypothermic despite the fire. We had to evacuate. Sarah's beneath barn room with no fire saved us. Saved 15 people total. I'm building a similar structure on my property this spring. By the end of January 1879, 10 families had approached Sarah requesting consultation on beneath barn heating design. She charged nothing for sharing knowledge, would visit their farms, examine their barns, explain how to excavate safely beneath existing structures, taught them to calculate animal heat production based on livestock numbers, showed them proper insulation techniques. Sarah lived in her beneath barn room for 6 years, from age 15 to 21. The dwelling remained comfortable year-round through all seasons and weather conditions. Summer temperature stayed at 55 degrees, cool and pleasant when outside temperature reached 90 degrees. Winter temperature maintained at 60 degrees regardless of blizzards or cold snaps. The animal heat above provided completely reliable passive heating that never fluctuated based on external conditions. The arrangement with Henry Whitmore evolved beyond simple labor exchange. Henry, watching Sarah's work ethic and innovation, began teaching her farm management and business principles. At 17, she was managing most of his farm operations. At 18, Henry formally deeded her 20 acres of his property, not as payment, but as partnership recognition. He'd come to see her as the daughter he'd never had and wanted to ensure she had property ownership. She continued developing beneath barn heating knowledge, experimented with different insulation materials, tested ventilation systems to prevent moisture buildup, calculated optimal room sizes based on animal numbers. By age 19, she'd created design specifications that could be applied to any farm with enclosed livestock. The concept spread beyond Cottonwood Flats. Farmers from neighboring counties came to study Sarah's beneath barn room. Agricultural newspapers published articles about passive heating using animal heat. The innovation that had seemed degrading was being recognized as significant advancement in frontier resource efficiency. By 1884, 6 years after Sarah built her beneath barn room, 12 similar structures existed in the region. The Patterson family's emergency shelter built in 1879, 3 farms that had built beneath barn living quarters for hired workers, 2 families who'd built beneath barn spaces as winter retreats, 4 farmers who'd built beneath barn root cellars that stayed perfectly temperature stable year-round using animal heat. She married at 22 to a veterinarian who'd come to study her beneath barn heating system. They built a house together, but kept the beneath barn room as winter shelter and cold storage. Raised 3 children, teaching them that unconventional solutions often outperform conventional approaches when you understand underlying physics. The original beneath barn room still exists beneath Henry Whitmore's barn, now owned by the Kansas Historical Society. Modern thermal analysis confirms what Sarah proved in 1878. Livestock in enclosed barns generate significant heat that can be captured and utilized through proper architectural design. The beneath barn room maintained stable temperature year-round using zero fuel. The historical marker reads, Sarah Coleman Morrison, 1863 to 1934, agricultural innovator who designed passive heating system using livestock body heat, built beneath barn dwelling at age 15 that sheltered 15 people during 1878 blizzard using zero fuel for heating, demonstrated practical application of thermal mass and animal heat generation principles. The real story is about a 15-year-old kicked out with nothing who built shelter using physics most people didn't understand, who survived by recognizing that 12 animals generate 12,000 BTU per hour continuously, who saved 15 lives by building where heat naturally accumulated rather than where convention said homes should be built. Because sometimes the girl living beneath a barn understands thermodynamics better than people living in expensive cabins. The structure everyone called degrading was actually brilliant engineering using free renewable heat from livestock. And animal body heat, when properly captured through thermal mass, provides better heating than wood stoves, burning expensive fuel. Sarah died in 1934 at age 71. Her funeral was attended by families whose parents had survived in her beneath barn room, by farmers who'd adopted passive animal heat systems, by agricultural engineers who'd studied her thermal design. The beneath barn room still exists, still demonstrating that heat radiates through thermal mass regardless of direction. That livestock are heating systems producing constant BTU. That building beneath instead of beside can capture heat others waste. And sometimes the most unconventional location, beneath a barn, underground, with animals walking overhead, creates the most efficient shelter when you understand that physics doesn't care about convention and heat flows where thermal gradients direct it.